Well, hey, good morning. My name is Jesse, and I still work here. I do. It's been a while since I've been up here with you on the platform. So, and the reason for that is this: one of the things Prairie Lakes has really afforded me the chance to do, and graciously allowed me to do, is join a group of ministry consultants. Called the Unstuck Group, and it's just kind of a side thing that I'm doing, but we've used them as a church in the last few years, and I've had a chance to join their team, and so really a group of us kind of travel periodically throughout the year to different churches, just kind of help them out and help them strategize, help them reach their community. So I was doing a bunch of that in March, and one of those dates conflicted with a date I was supposed to be up here, and so back in March, I asked Pastor Shane to step in, and he did a great job. Maybe a little too good, honestly. No, he did awesome. So it's just been a while, but I'm really glad to be back with you and kind of almost close out our series that we've been in for a couple of months now through the book of Luke. And so we're going to do that again this week. But before we do, you're going to need a couple of things for this part of our service. You're going to need a Bible. We're in the Bible every single weekend here at Prairie Lakes because it is one of the primary ways that God speaks to us. It's His Word. And so we'll help you navigate. So we've got them in the seats somewhere, your phone. A lot of us use our phones and stuff like that. That's cool. The second thing you're going to want is something to write with, perhaps. If you want to take some notes on your bulletin. So ushers, if you guys would just come forward right now. And if you want something to write, just raise your hand. They'll find you, okay? Life's kind of been crazy for the Tinks, this brand of Tink, for the last couple of weeks. And that's really because my wife and I just sold our house, and then we bought another one, because you need another one if you sell yours. And we did that in like 72 hours. Yeah. You don't know whether to be happy or sad about that, do you? Right? And it's crazy. Now, we knew that this was going to be the year that we were going to put our house of 8 years on the market, so that wasn't a surprise. And we've been getting ready for that, not just around the house, but we've also been doing, really ever since January of this year, we've been doing a lot of open houses. We've been doing the open house thing. And it's kind of fun doing open houses. I know some of you guys do it as a hobby. So I don't think it's that fun. I don't think it's like that level of fun. But it's cool when you know that you're looking for your next house. It's just cool to get in houses and kind of start to think and figure out what you like and what you don't like and what's really important to you, because a lot of that gets clarified as you walk through and you walk away and you process together. And what my wife and I discovered was this. The thing that ended up being the most important to us in our next house was actually square footage. It was we just wanted a big house. We've got family that comes from out of town pretty often. We want to be able to host them, and we like hosting small groups, and we like having people over. And so we were willing to trade some other things for that, like maybe the location we wanted or some of the finishes, if it meant that we got the house that we wanted. But we really didn't know that was the most important thing until we looked at this one house back in February. And it wasn't the house that we ended up buying, but it was actually pretty close. It's in the same neighborhood. It's really similar. And but here was the crazy thing about this house that we looked at back in February. Here's the crazy thing. It was a rental. It was a rental. It was this big house in this really nice neighborhood, but it was a rental. Now, when I say it was a rental, what immediately comes to your mind? Right? What do you start thinking when I say that? What conclusions do you kind of immediately jump to? So you put yourselves into our shoes, okay? My wife and I, and then we've got these two little kids, 6 and 8, and it's February, so there's like 8 feet of snow on the ground still. So you're trudging into this open house, this nice neighborhood, it's this really big house. It looks great from the outside. Now, we walk in, and if you had to guess, was the house in like immaculate open house showing shape or not? Right? Not. It was not. In fact, okay, so you know the script, some of you who've done this, like you get in, and what's the first thing that you do when you get into open house? Right? Shoes come off. How many of you thought I was going to take my shoes? No. Shoes come off, right? And so we go to do that, and our little kids too, right? And the realtor, after greeting us, here's what he says at this open house. He goes, you're going to want to keep those on. Okay. So how did you know, right? How could you have guessed that the house wasn't in great shape? How did you know that? Just by saying that it's a rental, how could you guess that the house probably wasn't in all that great of shape? There's probably a lot of reasons, but the one I want to highlight is this. I think here's what kind of happens, when it comes to rentals. When you know the owner isn't around, okay? When you know the owner isn't around, it's easy to feel like you can just get away with treating the owner's property however you want. When you know the owner's not around, it's easier to feel like, it doesn't really matter. I can treat it however I want. I can get away with it. Those of you who own rentals, you know this. In fact, your blood might be starting to boil right now as I say that. Because you can do interviews, you can run background checks, you can do credit checks, you can get a deposit, you can have them sign agreements, whatever. The fact of the matter is this: there's still a very real risk that your tenant is going to treat your property however they want. And they might even think they can just get away with it, right? It's really hard. It's really hard to find a good tenant. It's really hard to find a good tenant. Well, this weekend, as we journey through chapters 19, 20, and 21 of Luke, Jesus is going to tell a really similar story to the one I just told you. He's going to tell it to a group of people who are listening to what he's saying as he tells this story, and they're going to get increasingly irritated. Increasingly irritated. Why? Because he's basically going to tell them, you guys are not very good tenants. You guys aren't very good tenants. So open up your Bibles with me to Luke 20. We're going to be looking at 9 through 19. If you're going through, a lot of us are in small groups, and we have a little booklet, and you're taking notes, that's great. We're going to be in 19, 20, and 21 this week. But just this weekend, we're going to be looking at this particular passage. And if you've never been in the Bible before, Luke's kind of more close to the end than the front. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the first 4 books of the New Testament. And they each tell the story of Jesus and who he is and what he said and what he did. Table of contents works great, but what we're going to do is we're going to actually read this passage first together, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what it means. So as you find that, here's what you're going to be reading. You're going to be reading a parable. And a parable is this. A parable is a fictional story that has a spiritual meaning. It's a completely made up story. Jesus does this all the time. He loves to do this, but it illustrates something that's true. It's real. It's a spiritual truth. And sometimes he likes to tell these stories not only to illustrate a spiritual truth, but he loves to tell them sometimes to illustrate a story that is spiritually true about the people he's talking to right there in real time. So let's read together in Luke 20, starting in verse 9. Jesus, he went on to tell people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, and he rented it to some farmers, and he went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him, and they sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one they also beat and treated shamefully, and they sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him, and they threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "Well, what shall I do? I will send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him." Okay? So let's just kind of stop there for a second, because parables are sometimes hard to understand, especially 2,000-year-old parables in a different part of the world, because there's elements in parables that are a one-to-one correlation, like something in the parable symbolizes something spiritual, but then there's other elements in the parable that are just kind of color or details to the story. So let's just get a sense of the picture that Jesus is painting here. On the screen next to me is going to be a key, and if you want to take some notes, I know it's a lot of information, but just go ahead and start writing that down. We'll talk about it here in a little bit. It's going to help guide us in understanding the parable and what these things, represent. So as you write, just get this picture. Jesus is telling this story, and if you went back up to the top of chapter 20, you would see that he's telling it in around the temple itself. He's in the temple courts. The temple itself is in the background, and he's telling this story to a group of people who gather there at the temple to listen to people teach. And in within earshot of Jesus, there really are two groups of people. There's people that are just very much like us. They're normal, everyday, kind of church-going types that have decided to quote-unquote come to church on a weekend and just listen to someone talk about God and his word. And that's primarily who's there. That's most of the crowd. But then there's also church staffers, so to speak. There's Jewish religious leaders whose job, whose vocation, is to run things at the temple. So that's the setting, and that's who's listening. Jesus, he's at the temple, and he's talking to people who are just normal, everyday folks, and he's talking to people who are religious leaders. He's got churchgoers and he's got church staffers. And he lights into this story about people who were renting some farm ground, actually. And then this is not unfamiliar, really, to us. I mean, this same story happens in every county of our state. But it's a parable, okay? So it's not really a story about a vineyard. It's actually a story about God and his people. So take a look at the key here, okay? God is the person who the owner of the vineyard represents. This is God. That's who Jesus is talking about. And when Jesus tells a story about the vineyard, here's what the vineyard is. The vineyard is kind of the world that God created. The whole world is kind of God's vineyard generally. But specifically, Jesus is talking about the temple. The temple. It's the place where God is worshiped and things are organized and run as it should be, as God desires. And the tenants that Jesus is talking about, the tenants are human beings generally, but also specifically, Jesus is really talking about these Jewish religious leaders whom God entrusted with the care and leadership of worship at the temple. See, God created this world, and we're tenants in the world that God created. We're supposed to tend to this world as God designed, but specifically, he set up leaders who are supposed to run worship as God designed. And as Jesus tells this story, he talks about the owner sending his servants to collect some fruit. In the story, that's how they would pay rent. They would raise these crops and they would send a portion of the crops back to the owner as rent. But these servants are like all of the prophets and the leaders that God has sent over in history to do what? To remind them of who God is, to remind them that God's in charge, to remind them of what God expects, to remind them that God has tasked us with being fruitful. And the tenants, of course, in the story, treat these servants horribly and abusively, just like they did to God's prophets in the Old Testament. But then finally in the story, the owner of the vineyard sends his son, and here's Jesus is talking about himself. And he is alluding to something that's going to happen to him just in the next few days. All right? So if you were in the crowd that day, right above the entrance of the temple, you would have seen this big, golden, decorative cluster of grapes hanging from a decorative golden vine. And it was actually part of the symbolic decor of the temple itself. Why? Because this is the dominant metaphor God uses when he's describing his people. His people are to be fruitful. His people are to live the kind of life that brings about the kind of world that God desired and designed. So that's the story so far, okay? But Jesus continues to tell it, so let's just keep reading along together. And I'm going to put the next verse on the screen here. This is verse 14. Jesus continues to tell the story by saying, "But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over." They saw the son, they talked the matter over. "This is the heir," they said. "Well, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard, and they killed him. And this is exactly what the people who are listening to Jesus preach this are going to do in just a few days. The same people who have gathered to hear him preach here are going to scheme and then eventually shout for him to be crucified for what he preached. But I want to just camp on these couple of verses for a little bit. And as you look at this part of the story that Jesus is telling, I want you to ask yourselves this question. Ask yourselves this question. What do you think the tenants thought about the owner? What did the tenants think about the owner? What assumptions did the tenants make about who the owner was? What kind of guy he was? What did they think about the owner? He sent a servant and we beat him up and we sent him away with nothing. That's what happened. And then he didn't really do anything. We didn't really hear from him. He sent another one. We did the same thing to him and more, and we sent him packing, and still no word from the guy who apparently owns this vineyard. And then another one, and we wounded him and we kicked him to the curb, and the owner never really said boo about it. I mean, he just didn't. What did these tenants think about the owner, if you had to guess? My two kids are still pretty young. And they're really good kids. They are. They're awesome. They're well behaved. They obey the first time they're told. And my wife and I get compliments about them like all the time. You have such well behaved kids. Like my favorite is like at like Chick-fil-A or McDonald's. When someone behind the counter says, "You have such well behaved kids," like that's wow. Okay. But that compliment sometimes is given to us by parents who are a little bit further along than my wife and I. Parents who either are or have parented teenagers. And when they give us this compliment, "You have such well-behaved kids," a lot of the times those parents will follow it up with something like, "I remember when it was just that easy." "You have such well-behaved kids. I remember when my kids were happy most of the time, not a care in the world, and they listened to everything we said." Enjoy this age while you can, because it gets a little bit harder, right? I mean, like all those things that they follow up with. And you know what? I can actually start to see it already. As great as my kids are, there's more and more times where my initial correction and discipline just isn't taken very seriously. Or maybe as seriously and quickly as it once was. There's a little snicker where there wasn't a snicker before. Or they're not really quick to stop and listen. Like they just continue to do what I told them not to do, what I'm telling them not to do. Like I'm not serious, Like I'm not going to back up what I told them to do or stop doing. Like I'm all bark and no bite. And they are mistaken. Because I am not all bark. I can see they're starting to think of me a little bit differently. Now, what do you think those tenants thought about this owner? What do you think they thought? I think it's probably the same thing that kids start to think of their parents as they get older. Like, he's not going to do anything. He's not serious. We can get away with kind of whatever we want to do. It's just not that big of a deal. In the story, I mean, they were thinking, this doesn't have to be his land. It doesn't have to be his ways. It doesn't have to be his rules. It doesn't have to be his world. It can be ours. It can be our way, our rules. I think in Jesus' story, these tenants thought that they were dealing with an absentee owner. Someone who wasn't around. And because he wasn't around, he wasn't really going to do anything about it, about anything they did. Even when it came to how they responded to his son, it just didn't matter. At least this is what they thought. But it turns out they were also mistaken, because take a look at the next part of the story Jesus tells here in verse 15. He asks this question, "What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them?" Well, he'll come and he'll kill those tenants. And he'll give the vineyard to others. That escalated quickly, didn't it? See, Matthew, another gospel writer, shares this same story that Jesus tells here in Luke. And when Matthew shares the story, he actually records someone in the crowd answering Jesus' question before Jesus answers it himself. In Matthew's account, what will the owner of the vineyard do to them? Here's what someone says in the crowd. In the crowd, they say, "He'll bring those wretches to a wretched end," they replied, "and he'll rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of crop at the harvest time." See, some of them knew Some people in the crowd that day knew, because they lived in the real world. If there was an owner who sent his son to collect rent, and those renters killed that son, of course the owner's going to get revenge on him for the horrible thing that they did. And then he would give this vineyard to someone else who would give him his share of the crops. And this is really where Jesus starts to zero in on the religious leaders in the crowd. Because what he's saying here in this verse to them is this. Hey, God's entrusted you with the leadership of his temple, his vineyard. You are the example. He set you up to be the example. You're supposed to live and relate and worship in a way that points the rest of the entire world to God. You're supposed to produce the kind of fruit, the kind of life that God desires, but you haven't done it. And you're not going to. You're even going to kill his own son, just like the tenants in the story. You will kill the son of the owner of this world. Not only are you going to rob God of what's rightfully his, and rob the world of a picture of who he is, you think you're going to get away with it. There's only one way that story ends. So let's go ahead and let's just listen to Jesus finish this parable and pick it back up halfway through verse 16. Halfway through verse 16, when the people heard Jesus say this, they said, God forbid. God forbid. And Jesus looked directly at them and asked, then what's the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. And the teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken this parable against them. But they were afraid of the people. So here's where it gets real, because remember, within earshot, there's two groups of people. There's your normal everyday churchgoers, decent people, I'm sure, and then you got these church staffers, these Jewish religious leaders, two groups of people, and two very different responses to how Jesus' story ends. Two very different responses. How did the churchgoers respond? How did the people in the crowd respond? They said two words. God forbid, God forbid. Almost like they can't imagine a scenario in which either the tenants, the human beings in this world, would be so wicked, or the owner, God, would be so vengeful. They can't imagine, just shocked, can't even fathom. God forbid. How did the Jewish religious leaders respond? Offended and angry, like how dare you, Jesus, how dare you talk about us like you did? How dare you label us or judge us or even suggest that we've done anything that would merit such a response from God? Two different responses, shock and offense. But I think they have something in common. See, whether shocked or offended at the idea of a God who punishes wrongdoing, whether shocked or offended, all right? Both groups seem to think that God is kind of an absentee owner. He's kind of an absentee owner. I can't believe that God would ever do anything like that. I'd be shocked. That's not the God I know. Or there's no way that I've ever done anything that would merit that kind of reaction from God. That is offensive to me. God would never. God would never. God's not going to do anything. It's this idea that God is an absentee owner, that God created this world and he put us in charge of it, and he just doesn't really care how we live, how we treat one another, how we treat this world that he created for us and put us in charge of. We can just live however we want, and we can respond to even his son however we want, because we're going to be fine. Now, look at how Jesus responds to these reactions, shock and offense. Look at how he responds to this idea that God is basically an absentee owner. Now let's just put this on the screen again as we read it one more time. Jesus looked directly at them and he asked, then what's the meaning of that which is written? And he's going to quote from Psalm 118 here. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And then he says in verse 18, let's go to the next one, please. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. Jesus is quoting this psalm, and he's going to give it a new meaning as he quotes it to them. And what he's saying here is that I am the stone. Jesus is the stone the builders rejected, meaning you are going to reject me. But then he says, God is going to make the very person you rejected into a cornerstone. And on me, on Jesus, God's going to build a new house and a new place of worship and a new way of worshiping and a new people and a new family. You're going to reject me, but God is going to build a brand new movement on me. The stone that builders rejected has become the cornerstone. That's what's going to happen. And then he issues a warning, a direct warning. And that word direct that we saw in yellow there literally means he looked them straight in the eye. He looks people straight in the eye, not worried about their shock and not worried about their offense. And he says, essentially, blazingly clear, he says, God is not an absentee owner. It might shock you, it might offend you. He is not an absentee owner. And what he's watching for is how you respond to his son whom he sent. That's what he's watching for. God's not an absentee owner. He's seen it all. Like we sometimes think that just because we've done things and we haven't seen some sort of immediate retribution or punishment on the part of God or anything like that, that he's just kind of ignorant. But he's seen it all. He's seen it all. He's seen all of the ways in which we've loved ourselves at the expense of our neighbor. Every single time. He's seen all those times where we asked for forgiveness, but we refused to extend it to someone else. He's seen all the times that we've chased after and held on to everything that we've earned, and we've used it only to advance our own security, comfort, or image. And we've withheld it from using it in the way that he designs, in the way that he's commanded. He's seen everything. All those hidden things. All those public things. He's seen all of it. He hasn't ignored it. God's not an absentee owner. He's not. He put us here. He put us in his world. He put us in his vineyard. And he's seen. He's seen what we've done. And before he comes to punish us for how we've messed up his world and how we've messed up our lives and how we've messed up one another, before he does that, what does he do? He sends his son. And instead of judging us for messing up his vineyard, he places all of our sin, all of those things that we did, and all the ways we messed up our lives, and all the ways we've hurt others. He's put all of that mess in this world. He placed that on his son Jesus and judges his son Jesus for us instead of judging us. And for those of us who believe that, for those of us who don't get shocked and don't get offended at this idea that we've really screwed up, for those of us who have the humility to just accept what is obviously true about us, for those of us who accept this idea that God has every right to hold us accountable for it, for those of us who believe that instead of judging us for our own sin, that God judged his son, that he sent his son Jesus into the world and he put all of our sin on Jesus at the cross. Punishing him for what we've done, charging Jesus for the penalty that should have been ours to pay. For those of us who step across that line of faith and believe that Jesus has done something for us that we could never, ever do for ourselves. For those of us who believe that on Jesus, God is building a new family and a new people and a new community. Not on the basis of how good of a farmer we've been in his world, but on the basis of how good Jesus has been to us. For those of us who are like that, we enjoy being a part of this new family built on the cornerstone that is Jesus. But here's the hard part. For those of us who don't, for those of us who reject his son, you got to understand that. It's not for those of us who have sinned. All of us are in that same boat, right? For those of us who reject Jesus and his message about who he is and what he did and why we needed it and what God is doing through Jesus. For those of us who choose shock and offense over the gospel of Jesus, then Jesus will either be a stumbling block that causes us to fall, or eventually we'll just be crushed under the weight of our own sin. Because God's not an absentee owner. He's not. He's patient. He is patient. There is no doubt about that. But don't mistake his patience for blindness. Don't mistake his willingness and his deep desire for you to respond to his son, Jesus, and step across that line of faith. Don't mistake that willingness for ignorance. God's not an absentee owner. He's just waiting for you to respond to his son, Jesus. So let me pray towards that end, okay? Father in heaven, this is a tough one for a lot of us. Because a lot of us, like me, all of us, God, as human beings, we kind of want to justify ourselves. We kind of want to feel like we're in charge of it. Like nobody's going to tell us what to do. Nobody's going to tell us that we're either so bad or we're so good or we're so whatever that we need someone else. God, even if we're willing to admit that we're not perfect, even if we're willing to admit that you have a right to hold us accountable, even so, God, a lot of us, it's just so hard. It's just so hard to surrender control and to humble ourselves. And to look to your son, Jesus, and say, I need you. I can't do it on my own. I can't fix myself. God, I just want to pray specifically for those of us in that spot who can see our predicament and who are just struggling to surrender to your son, Jesus. God, would you come alongside like a father with his daughter or his son, and would you place your arm around them? And would you remind them of just how much you love them and how much better life would be with you, your way, because of what your son Jesus has done? God, for those of us who are still stuck in our shock, or still stuck into our offense, would you remind them that this is a place where no matter who they are, where they've been, what they've done, what's been done to them, that they can still come and they can still look. Would you stay after them in your love and your grace? Thank you, God, for not being an absentee owner. Jesus, we pray this all in your name.